Convent High School. Chapter 8, How Do Organisms Reproduce? Class 10th. Myself, Dipali. In this section, we are going to study about sexual reproduction in flowering plants. Now, we all are very much familiar with a flower. They are so beautiful, and we all are attracted towards their fragrance, their color, and we all like to see and touch the flowers. But we are going to study flowers in a scientific manner in this chapter. What are actually flowers? They are not just ornaments to decorate your homes or to get scent or fragrance and perfume from them, nor they are just to be offered to God, but they are actually the reproductive organs of flowering plants. Reproductive organs which help to develop a new seed, and that seed is going to give birth to a new plant. So, when you talk about a flower, first let us discuss the parts of a flower. Now, the parts of the flower, if you try to observe in a normal flower, there are many variety of flowers as such, but each of them have different structures and each of them might be little bit different from each other depending upon the plant. But if you try to observe a normal bisexual flower, then you will see sepals, petals, anther or stamens and filaments, ovary, pistil, stigma and style. These are the basic parts of any fully developed flower. Now let us discuss about each and every part of this flower. The reproductive part of the angiosperms are located in the flowers. You have already studied the different parts of flowers: sepals, petals, stamen and pistil. Stamen and pistil are the reproductive parts of the flowers which contain the germ cells. What possible functions would a petal and a sepal serve? Now, the parts of the flowers are called as whorls. And there are four main whorls of the flowers. The sepals, if you observe, they are the green projections which you see at the lower end near the stem of the flower. The base on which they stand, all these four whorls stand, is called as thallus. Thalamus. Now, on that, these sepals, which are green petal-like structures, are present, which are actually present in the flower during the bud stage as a protective cover. Once the flower blooms, their function is over. So, the function of sepal is to protect the flower in the bud stage, and they are generally green in color in most of the flowers. After that comes the petals or the corolla. They are present in the flower as colorful, fragranted parts which attract insect. The main function of corolla is to attract insects, birds, animals for pollination. Because without pollination, the flower cannot form seed. So the function of petal is to attract insects, animals, birds, etc. for pollination. Then the main parts of the flower which are responsible for reproduction are the Androecium and the Gynosium. And Gynosium. Now this Androecium and Gynosium are actually the flowers part which help in reproduction. The androecium is also called as stamen, and it is the male reproductive organ, which is contained of two more parts, anther and filament. The bulb-like structure over the top is the anther. If you see a magnified structure of an anther, it is something like this, which is generally yellow in color. And the stick or the stem with which it is connected to the thallus or the petals or the connecting point, it is called the filament. The filament's function is just to hold the anther. And this anther, if you dissect and cut it open, you find this type of 4 chambers in it which are filled with pollen grains. And these pollen grains consist of the germ cell or the male egg cell, which are generally very minute microscopic structures which has a spiny body in the outermost coat. This is what you call as pollen grains, which plays the role in germination. After that, you have the gynosium, which you can observe here. This whole part is known as gynosium, which is made up of three major parts: the stigma, style, and ovary. Now, the stigma is a stage-like structure on which the pollen grains germinate. Style is the tube which connects the stigma and the ovary, and through which the pollen tube will develop. It is just a pathway through which the pollen grain travels and reaches the ovary. Now, ovary is the sac which contains the ovules, which are the female reproductive cells, and which has inside it the egg cells. So, you can say the stamen consists of two parts, anther and filament. And the pistil or the gynosium consists of three major parts. They are stigma, style, and ovary. An ovary contains ovules, which are the female egg cells, and anther contains pollen grains, which are the male egg cells. This is what we talk about the major parts of the flower. So, now you know the functions of petals and sepals. So, flower may be unisexual. Unisexual examples are papaya and watermelon. That means when it contains either stamen or pistil, only one present in each flower. So, you have a male plant and a female plant in this type of species. Now, bisexual, hibiscus, mustard, etc. When it contains both stamen and pistil in the same flower, it is called as bisexual flowers. Now, stamen, as we talked about, is the male reproductive part, and it produces pollen grains which are yellowish in color. The powdery structure or the powdery substance which sticks to your hand when you touch a flower is the pollen grains. You must have seen this yellowish powder that often sticks to our hand if we touch the stamen of the flower. Pistil is present in the center of a flower and is the female reproductive part, and it is made up of three parts as we already discussed. The bottom swollen part is the ovary, the middle elongated part is the style, and the terminal part is the sticky stigma, which provides the stage for the pollen grains to germinate. The ovary contains ovules and each ovule has an egg cell. The male germ cell produced by pollen grain fuses with the female gametes present in the ovules. This fusion of germ cell or fertilization gives us the zygote, which is capable of growing into a new plant. So, now let us understand how the process of fertilization takes place in the flower. And what are the modes? Now, there can be two types of modes of pollination. Now, first thing, what is pollination? Pollination is the process of transfer of pollen grains from the anther of the stamen to the stigma of the pistil. It is called as pollination. So, you can define pollination as pollination is a process of transfer of pollens from anther of stamen to the stigma of pistil is called pollination. Are you understanding this? So that is called pollination. Now this pollination can be of two major kinds: self-pollination and cross-pollination. Now what is self-pollination? When the transfer of pollen grains occurs in the same flower, that is, if this is a flower and the pollen grains travel from the anther of the same flower to the same flower, it goes here, then it is called as self-pollination. Whereas in cross-pollination, the pollen grains travel from one flower to the other flower. That is called cross-pollination. It could be on the same plant or it could be on the other plant. And for this, they require agents. And that agents for pollination can be wind, water, insects, or animals. Etc. So this is what we talk about pollination. Now once the pollination has occurred, that is, the pollen grain has reached to the stigma, then what does happen? Let us see. So here you can read it that thus the pollen needs to be transferred from the stamen to the stigma. If this transfer of pollen occurs in the same flower, it is referred to as self-pollination. On the other hand, if the pollen is transferred from one flower to another flower, it is referred to as cross-pollination. This transfer of pollen from one flower to another flower is achieved by agents like wind, water, and animals. After the pollen lands on the suitable stigma, it has to reach the female germ cell, which are in the ovaries. For this, a tube grows out of pollen grains and travels through the style to reach the ovary. That is called as germination of the pollen grain and development of the pollen tube. So here the process of fertilization starts. Once the pollen grain reaches the stigma, the pollen tube germinates and it grows till the ovary. And there is a small opening in the ovary through which it enters inside the ovary. Now once it has entered inside the ovary, this pollen tube contains two germ cells of male, and this is carried into the ovule. So now, after the pollen lands on the suitable stigma, it has to reach the female germ cells which are in the ovary. For this, a tube grows out of the pollen grain and travels through the style to reach the ovary. After fertilization, the zygote divides several times to form embryo within the ovule. So once the male germ cell reaches the ovule, it fuses with the fusion of male and female gametes occurs, and this process is called as fertilization. Once the fusion of male and female gametes has occurred, then the fertilization turns or produces a zygote, and zygote is capable of growing into a new plant. Now after the fertilization, what happens? The zygote divides several times to form embryo within the ovule. This ovule develops a tough coat and is gradually converted into a seed. The ovary grows rapidly and ripens to form fruits. The fruits which we are eating, the flesh of the fruit. Meanwhile, the petal, sepal, stamen, style and stigma may swell and fall off. Have you ever observed any flower part still persisting in the fruits? Try and work out the advantages of set formation for the plants. The seed contains the future plant or the embryo which develops into a seedling under appropriate conditions, and this is called as germination. So did you see how the whole new plant can germinate from just one small flower, which we all love to touch and see? Now let us discuss a little bit about the seed, which is actually a small plant itself in itself. So soak a few seeds of Bengal grams chana and keep them overnight. Drain the excess water and cover the seeds with a wet cloth and leave them for a while. Now make sure that the seeds do not become dry. Cut open the seed and carefully observe the different parts. Compare your observation with the figure and see if you can identify the parts. Now, the embryo is the future plant which develops into a seedling. Now, once the embryo has developed, it is having the following structures: a radicle, that is the future root, a plumule, that is the future shoot, and cotyledon, which is the storehouse of the fruits. Now some plants may have a single cotyledon or some plant may have double cotyledon, two cotyledons. So they are classified as dicots and monocots. All cereals are monocots and all pulses are generally dicots. Now the cotyledon, which stores the food, provides nutrients to the plants. Once the development of plant starts or germination of the seeds starts. Now, once that is done, the radicle is known as future shoots and plumule, and the zygote divides several times to form the embryo, giving rise to this seed. And now our plant will start germinating, which again will develop roots, shoots, flowers, stems, and will grow into a fully mature plant. Once it has developed into a fully mature plant, it will develop into a new plant and give rise to new flowers and fruits. This is how reproduction occurs in plants. So, Now in next session, we will be studying about reproduction in human beings. Thank you for now.